All right. So I'm going to let people in, but it's incredibly casual. We just have a conversation. That's it. And then we, somewhere around the 40-30 minute mark, depending on how things are going, I'll start bringing in more questions. But people will ask in the chat. You don't have to pay attention to the chat. I will. But if you want to, you're obviously allowed to. But usually the first 5 minutes, we're just kind of chatting because people usually 5 minutes is what it takes for uh, most of the people who are going to attend to make it
The
here.
the drizzle.
To drizzle, right? But yeah, man, thanks for doing this.
No problem. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, as the authority on force plates, now that you wrote a chapter for the NSCA sports um,
Kind of
science textbook,
it kind of became like a default crown, like mantle piece of
right?
like
You should, yeah, seize it, seize it. Does Since you wrote that chapter with a ForceDex founder, does Hawken hate you, or are you cool with those guys?
I actually haven't talked to them since they came out, and I hadn't written the chapter at that point.
Mm.
Um, so I'm not sure if they dislike me or not. They definitely haven't reached out to ask anything of me.
They don't realize your level yet. No, Hawken. I used ForceDex and then Valve up until I came here, and we use Hawken here. And they've improved a ton from their first iteration. I like them a lot. There's some barriers, but same with Valve. So I don't know that at this point it's kind of more of a what are you looking for? I would say Hawken has the edge on smoothness of running people through it, just because the interface is designed for you to do the test, not to really pull anything from it, which is also a little bit of a barrier if you're operating with it as making decisions at point of service. So from a rehab perspective, I found it a little bit more, but been working with them. They have some updates that they're doing where they're going to let you be able to compare tests. So on the tablet that you pull your test from, you'll also be able to get a quick heads up of progression from the last time, which is really the biggest thing if I'm making a call for a test thing to do.
See,
So
I have no stake in Valve, and I have no need to sell them, but they are pretty nimble now at making improvements. Like they came out with a wireless force plate to kind of match what Hawking was doing, and then they even retrofitted the old ones. I don't know if you've seen that.
I didn't know
So
that.
like we have sets across all of our organization, all of our affiliates, and we had old ones, and they sent out these little orange packs that you plug the force plates in, and it acts as both a Bluetooth signal and a power pack. So you can go like wireless,
Interesting.
double wireless, and then you could just charge that power pack the day after whatever. Um,
So
so you
they
can do
use
on the go.
Bluetooth.
Yeah,
They use Bluetooth. Okay.
yeah, the app works pretty well. And then the other thing about Valve that I like is the fact that now there's so many products that are intertwined in the
Mm-hmm.
same system. And while the Valve Hub at times can be a pain in the ass, it's also really cool to just click on your tabs of like, what was this guy's Nordboard? What was this guy's force plate stuff?
Yeah.
What was this guy's force frame stuff? Now we have the new dynamos, which is so far it looks like it can be really cool. It's the
Yep.
handheld dynamometer with multi-tool, we'll call it. So their ecosystem is growing quite quickly.
And nicely. I mean, I have nothing good but good things to say about my years using them, and I'd be perfectly fine walking into a place and having either one in front of me.
Yeah.
At this point, the honestly the biggest barriers are more just internal aspects of military facilities with terrible internet connectivity and firewall stuff. So cloud things do not work amazingly, but that's not a problem with the product. That's more of the location. So your background, when did you start using the force plates? I was back in Canada, right?
Yep. So first time I started using force plates was at a private facility in Toronto named Fitz. Founder there, Dr. Thomas Lamb, was a really forward-thinking guy. We were a bit on a bootstrap kind of budget, but we were always trying to think of like what is the next thing we're going to need. And we had a really cool open concept of clinic and sport performance. So we're constantly looking at like how we're measuring return to play and how we're measuring performance and volume back and forth. So we first got a pair of Pasco plates around
Mm,
2011, 2012, which was
okay.
super clumsy at the time because like it doesn't come with software. So we were just sort of like exporting the raw data. And the first set of, force time curves we did were literally just copying into Excel and looking at a graph
Yep.
and
Yep.
pulling that out. And so just calculating jump height was the very first thing. And we had to go back to math, physics, and biomechanics, and put those in ourselves. And then I found we weren't nimble with it at all to like monitor someone on the daily. But
Right.
we did learn a lot, like just watching people do exercises on the plates and seeing like repeat jumps. What does it look like for an Olympic alpine skier compared to a wrestler? And what does that mean about athletic performance and traits of reactivity and stuff and what kind of curves they create? I did Olympic weightlifting on them to look at like, what does it clean look like? What does it snatch? So I thought it was a really cool educational experience to learn more about the exercises we were doing through plates. And
Right.
then I became the head strength coach at one of our Olympic training centers in 2014 in Montreal at the Institut National du Sport du Québec. And there we had really good quality force plates. We had AMTI plates because we had a
Okay.
full-time biomechanist. And at the time, the application was always sport related. So he would use the plates to look at an athletic movement in a sport, try to figure out what that meant and how to, reverse engineer that aspect. So, one time they put them on the blocks for swimming, dive takeoffs to see what that was. We put them on a tower for diving. So at the time, they were sort of just a special project tool, a
Hmm.
kind of one-off for an Olympic sport. And that's when the research out of Australia and UK started to come out, using it for jumps and monitoring and stuff. And I said, dude, we have these world-class force plates. Let's figure out how we can put this in our daily environment. Because I figured there's a huge win for both the clinic and the performance side. So then we started to do daily jumps. And we actually built our own software because we had the kind of people in-house that could do that.
Right.
That's when I first met Daniel Cohen. ForceDex wasn't part of the Valve
Yeah.
family yet. We had a MATLAB set of scripts, but we
Yeah.
kind of built a system of collection, export, and then we had macros in a Excel sheet that did our, daily variance type stuff for each individual. So every individual that we worked with had their own Excel sheet. We had a button that would say, import this file, give me my colors and go. And we could do all that within about 3 or 4 minutes. So you could have an athlete jump and we could get some info and make a decision in the moment.
Yeah.
And by the time I left there and came to the Cubs, there's now no longer, to what we were saying earlier, there's no longer a reason to really build your own unless you really want to understand how it works.
Right.
Because Force
Or
X and
budget.
right.
So budgetary, you can still get a set of Pasco plates, and I know as a clinic, they have an educator pricing, and if you tell them that you have students who come in, they will, and I know this because I did it. They will give you the education pricing because you're doing it as an educational aspect, and you can download. You no longer have to build your own, like the Excel sheets. I know we made one that's available on ResearchGate for isometric testing. And then I know the group out of the UK has at least the jump ones that you can
Yeah.
do. So you can get into them if you want to for about, I think, what is it? Probably, well, I don't know what the price is now. It was for something before to get a dual set. But to your point, it's clunky. And that was really the thing. So I was using SparkView with Pasco in the beginning, and right, so it exports it, you copy paste it into the Excel file, you hit play, and you learn so much about just basic physics by
Yeah.
starting to do that and hack it. And like writing up the Excel stuff was phenomenal because you said, why isn't it doing the thing I want to? And then getting questions from people, how come his force was higher than mine, but I jumped higher? And you're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, wait, because force, peak force is not why you jump high, it's total impulse. Oh, okay. So you actually have to start understanding how this
Yeah.
stuff works. So I found that incredibly valuable. What do y'all use there? You use the valve stuff, right?
Yeah, we're all valid. In fact, I think at the Olympic Center too, after I left, I believe they ended up getting valid anyway. We had this system that was working, but it was very much like it was very confined to like the things we had decided we wanted to be really good at, and then now Valve is so open and with all the different test types and the auto detection is really good that now if you all of a sudden wanted to do all these different isometric versions, all these different jump versions, every time we thought of a new test, we literally had to rewrite scripts to understand like
Which,
there's the
yeah,
physics of this that's different than another one if we wanted to know the answer. So they eventually moved out too, just because it's not worth it at the end of the day to keep reprogramming if someone's pretty good at it now.
right. Which brings you to the opposite problem, which is abundance of variables and abundance of abilities. And the beauty of having to build your own is it's so much work that you just start learning how to use what you have available. And so you really drill deep on it, as opposed to when you can do 4,000 variables for 482 tests. That's kind of where tonight's conversation then becomes is, all right, we have too many things available. And when we look at force plates, my view, and I'm interested in your thought on this, is you have two main ideas that you can do with force plates. One of them is monitoring the individual's response to the training. So, sort of a neuromuscular response, right? Fatigue, that fitness fatigue model.
Yeah.
The other one is testing serially whether or not what you're doing is changing what you care about. So the one is the actual fitness, and then the other is the fitness fatigue. And I would say the third thing that I do see a lot, I personally have some issues with it. Curious on your thoughts, is the idea of one-off testing. People come in, you do the test, and you say, "Oh, you're great, go." And I just don't find that to be like, if you're going to do that, it's almost purely isometric testing for me, maybe a counter movement jump. You're looking at one or two things and that's about it. But would you agree with that differentiation as the goals that we would have here?
Yeah, I would not be as pessimistic about you about one-off testing.
Gotcha. Because you work with real athletes. You don't work with like your patient base, and this is a key thing. Is so I first started dabbling clinically, started using it more professional sport, and then started pulling it back into clinic more, and started realizing, wow, my Division I baseball pitcher nails these things. My person who's high school athlete, it takes us 3 to 4 rounds to get anywhere stable from some of these metrics.
Yeah. And I would say that on the profiling side, there are outputs that are somewhat predictive of sport performance that wouldn't tell you anything in a clinical setting that this person's improving, right? Just to be like, oh, they jumped 32 centimeters. That's not going to be like, yes, that means their knee's much better. Now it'd be pretty arbitrary at that point. But I can tell you the guy that's 60 instead of 30 is definitely likely better off in sports at certain tasks.
Right.
So that's where I.
So, yeah. So rehab wise, which one are you looking at?
So rehab wise, the paradigm is kind of like this. I think you start with, the tissue where obviously number one is, symptomatic and pain and inflammation. Then I think number two is going to be typically like trying to figure out isolated isometrics on different, can be either dynamometer or force plates. Force plates, you can do a few different things isometrically. Other than that, you're going to want dynamometers or crane scales or something like that to get really things. But that's where you kind of go and say, I'm going to isolate the area and find out whether my strength is now appropriate. Whether that means you have a baseline, you're going back to it, or whether you're saying it's equal to the other leg or within a range. but you kind of have to figure out that the tissue is capable of handling something first. Then you go into like a dynamic task, and that's when you start to judge whether this pattern is changing, right? Are they loading in a way that's either favoring a leg or not, or in the timing that you would expect for an athlete that's kind of ready to play? Because to your point about the monitoring side, the fitness fatigue, the training response and the fitness fatigue things are the same thing. They just present themselves in just shorter, longer time courses, but the responses are essentially just micro and macro match each other.
Right.
So an example is like, let's say that we're looking at an Achilles or a calf. The first thing you do is figure out how to test, gastroc or soleus, make sure those are strong, and then you're going to test jumping. But a person who's jumping, you can go on bilateral plates and say, oh, they're avoiding their leg or not. And then after that, you might say, are they actually loading aggressively in a way that would test these tissues in a pattern? Because most of the time, your first times on a plate, that's what you're going to see, is that the temporal factors of loading are going to be much less aggressive. They're going to be conservative in trying to test, those joints or those tissues. And so that's where we kind of go, is like going from micro to macro of like local, and then spread it out into the pattern. And then from the pattern, then you're looking at these responses of how does it respond? And you see these waves of like, how does it respond just from our rehab and, progressing to these next levels of exercise. But then when you start to go back into play, usually you get a big distortion again, where, the load of, wow, we let you run around and play, coming back, usually that might perturb a little bit the rehab process. It usually doesn't just go, ooh, the first time we get to run around, we're good now. It's usually like, okay, this exacerbated something. We're at the last stage, but the last stage sometimes can be very finicky.
Yeah. There's a couple things there that I'd like to drill into a little bit. One of them is, the first question, I guess, what ISO tests do you use with force plates?
We do a seated calf, standing calf, isometric mid-thigh pull, and then we do isometric squat with a belt.
Okay.
All on dual force plates, and that's pretty much it for isometrics on the plates. After that, they're dynamometers.
Do you ever do the ASH test for the shoulders?
Yes, and the ASH. Sorry, we did the ASH.
Okay. I was gonna say you're baseball now. I figured you had a shoulder thing in there. Okay. So very, very, very similar to me. The one that I'll go back and forth on is if I'm doing isometric mid-thigh pull, why am I also doing a squat?
So we don't do both. We only do the squat in case of loading through the spine that we're either concerned about, or, as you mentioned, we're baseball. If a guy is coming back from a Tommy John or a shoulder situation and really gripping on the bar, we think is not quite ready yet, it's contraindicated, but they're probably far enough along that, your legs are unaffected when you're talking elbow and shoulder. And we definitely want to track that. We don't want to wait a year to figure out if your legs are strong enough. So then we'll flip into the belt squat, and we kind of try to track them side by side. You can't convert them directly, but they'll essentially follow the same pattern if you have a data point.
And there's a ton of information on the setup for the isometric mid-thigh pull. I think the key thing that I would suggest anybody is look into it, because what is presented out there is not necessarily correct. You see a whole spectrum of ways that it is done. Isometric squat, though, you see less on it. I think 120 degrees of flexion at the knee is kind of what I've seen relatively standardized, and then a vertical torso, which is somewhat similar to, again, the isometric mid-thigh pull. And 100% with you, if the limiting factor on the test is not the thing you're trying to test, then use another test to measure what you're trying to measure. That's, I think, where we're going with that.
And, if you don't have a preconception on either one, I will say that sometimes if you've never done isometric mid-thigh pull, people will find it uncomfortable if they haven't been in that kind of like weightlifting position. Nobody finds the isometric squat uncomfortable. It's pretty easy and quick to do.
Yep.
We have a slightly different situation where we have longitudinal data in the mid-thigh pull, and we have a lot of models for performance on those metrics. So changing completely the squat messes up the models, which
Yep.
is a large part of my job, is figuring out what's going to make a guy reach the major league. So we try to get back to the mid-thigh pull wherever it's safe and appropriate, but we'll always use the squat as an intra. Or there are some athletes, there's a small number that never will do the isometric mid-thigh pull if it was either a back situation or something that you don't want to undo, because every time you do it blows them up. But with coaching, most people can get over that. And it's just, okay, that first time was uncomfortable. I get it. But, this is stay stagged, breathe.
Yeah.
Some intra-abdominal pressure and you're good to go.
Right. Things will, the other big, I think, nod to the squat and where I started using it more is it's a lot easier to set up in most clinics because you just need an anchor point on the ground that's rigid, as opposed to for an isometric mid-thigh pull, you need a bar that is stiff enough to where you're not getting much flex with it. And then you need something to anchor that bar down. Most people who first try this and then reach out are saying, "Oh, I picked up everything I had off of the ground." That person's strong. You have to remember, this is the strongest position you can put like the most weight somebody can move is in this position. So the numbers are relatively high here. And I found just the isometric squat as well. Clinically, it's a lot easier to solve for, even if you just build a little platform, put an eye bolt in it, or anchor an eye bolt into your floor. It works pretty well.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think two other things that I did originally when we were at the Olympic Center. So we ended up getting a custom rack made for the mid-thigh pull that you could pin at every place. But in order to get that budget approved to get a custom rack build, I had to sort of do a proof of concept. So the first time I had done it, I actually had an athlete that I knew the limits of their strength, and we literally just set blocks up and put like 5 plates on the bar and just got them into that position where we knew they would never move it. But that's only so practical. And then we got, like toe straps that you get at Home Depot for car, ratchet strap type of things. So we looped it under the cage onto itself. And then we had this, I don't remember even where we got it, but we had this like ring that we got that would slide on the collars of the bar, and it had a hook on it. So it hooks to the ring. And then you just tie those down to the same tautness on either side to a person. But it works really well if you could get the athlete to stay fairly disciplined to their position, like, because it's no longer fixed front to back, anterior, posterior, so it could really pivot. And, changing from person to person is a little bit annoying, letting slack out and then making sure the sides are even. So if you're running through like a battery of a team, you're not going to be able to fire through 20 people. But in a clinical setting, if you just have one, it could be a very easy fix to try and go, hey, I can set up a situation where this stays isometric for one person. And so I ran through the entire national judo team twice on that and showed that even in that scenario, it was highly reliable and valid. And then they gave me the money to build a rack.
Yeah. The other thing is a lot of the racks in clinics are not bolted to the floor. So that is something to be aware of as well if you're setting this up. And it also leads to the other isometric test that you mentioned, the standing or even more so seated calf. That is another thing that you get a ton of force output with. And that one, that same band setup, if your band is wide enough, you can do it where you wrap it over, put it over the knees, cinch it down tight on it. I don't know about you. I set up with about 10 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion when I'm testing this. I want them seated. I want that knee flex beyond about 110 degrees because I'm wanting to bias as much as I can that soleus. And then tension should be taken out with less than about a 1/4 inch of heel raise is my goal. So usually I'm yelling at people who show up with shoes with a lot of cushioning, and they're like, your runners show up with the Hokas. I'm like, we need a different shoe for that. But do you have any suggestions on setting that up from a clinical perspective?
Well, for us, we've done 2 different things. One, we've done it in the force frame. If anyone out there has a force frame, you can't have the paddles turned down and do it. The only thing is you really have to hold down the force frame with, the practitioner and other, because like you said, it is surprisingly a lot of force. So that is a little bit unnerving because it can move around a little bit, but in a situation where, you're traveling and you have a force frame around, then it works. we have isometric mid-thigh pull racks that clip in and go up. And so we'll just use an AirX pad on the thigh and under the bar. And that's usually enough where
Yep.
it's not too uncomfortable. And then we can find that same position by just moving the bar down and same thing. And then same thing, our racks are really tall, so we can go up and to get to a nearly fully extended slight bend at the knee, same thing, about halfway into the range of motion of plantar flexion. And then we lock the bar in.
So when you're doing the plantar flexion, you have the bar across your back.
Yeah.
Okay. I typically set up with the same way I do a isometric squat with the belt.
Got it.
And that's just because my frame does not go that high. So,
Right.
yeah, the advantage of the bar over the back for both the squat and the Achilles or plantar flexion is that it's a rigid point of fixation. Whereas if you're using the strap, then you need to have some kind of stabilization for them, and then you have to really be conscious, or at least I found I have to strictly coach not gripping, pulling, like there can't be any force being generated by the arm. So usually I'm doing finger touching the wall or fist directly into the wall is how they're allowed to stabilize themselves.
The one thing I'll say is when we do, plantar flexion, it's not so bad because you're kind of pretty much fully extended, so you can support that. In the past, we did try isometric squat with the bar on your back, the fixed bar, and that is not a good feeling on your back. If you want to picture how you could have discs blow out, it's an immovable bar, in that half position. So probably don't. We just tell
them they're robust. The biggest thing, you'll be fine. Walk it off, rub a little dirt in it. One of my biggest problems when I've played with the bar over the back, even if they're tolerating it, there's not a problem. There's a loss of posture. And so the knees are extending and it's starting to go more into that flex spine, whereas you cannot cheat it when it's a belt. That is, you'll get off of there and be like, oh man, that was my legs. I know I did something right there. So those are the main tests, but we have thousands of things we can look at. We don't have much time, right? You get 37 seconds per patient. And what are your metrics and what do you care about? Do you have like a general heuristic you use when you're looking at an isometric, or are you specific for each test? How are you approaching this?
With isometric, it's almost always going to come down to peak force first. And even I'll say, I know that RFD matters, but I'll usually just skip to the dynamic exercise. Like I don't need to see RFD of just that muscle group if I can just see the timing of the whole action together. So peak force is definitely the way to go. And the simplest way to do it, because the other isometric is we use the Nord board as well. And so we'll do the eccentric Nordic, but we will also in training and in the return to play process do an isometric version where we'll walk out one of the big heavy medicine balls, push up position on it, set the knee at about 135 degrees and do an isometric pull from that angle. And we find that it scales well with Nordic scores so that when an athlete's not quite ready to give out a full eccentric contraction because it's probably going to hurt them, that's a really good middle point to both get excitation and load into the hamstring and a checkpoint to see where that strength is at. So peak force is almost always going to be the thing. Like, does your tissue put out either a standard of force that you set because you do this a lot and you're likely going to need to cross this line to do this type of activity, which some of our actions are like that, like the ASH. We have more of a floor than a direct performance characteristic after that. And then once you think that tissue can create that force, then I move on to dynamic tests. Pretty much, we look at RFD sometimes, but I find RFD is so noisy that you have to be really sure that it's going to define your performance to really rely on it. Not to say that I can't also go, oh, that's interesting. Your force is the same, but RFD has gone up. I like that. That sounds like a good combination. But if you just said, hey, we're going to wait until you get this RFD, the problem is you might see rep to rep, 18, 22, 28% CV, in which case you go, was your intent the same each one? Were you just finding your position, or is it literally the the neuromuscular state of the tissue. It's really hard to do with RFD, so it's not one I like to use or rely on as much.
So to that point, because RFD is the hottest topic that everybody wants to discuss, Paul Comfort proposes, and I find for bilateral tasks it works, taking a force at a point in time as a proxy basically for that. So let's say 250 milliseconds in, and you look at force at that time point. Personally, and this especially with the ASH test, because my issue with single limb test is that you've now added two different points where you can have error in your identification of onset. And that is something we're always dealing with. And when we're looking at these short time frames and we're looking at rate of force, which is already noisy, that onset messes with us a lot. So I have even more problems looking at this rate when I'm doing unilateral testing. I like looking at impulse over the first 250 milliseconds because it's just a bigger area being colored in. And so if you miss a little bit, it's a more stable measure. What are your thoughts on impulse versus just force at a point in time?
Well, impulse is always going to be the cause, right, of the output. And I think if we ever want to go first principles, impulse is always where you want to go, because by literal physics definition and Newton's laws, the impulse is going to create the acceleration. So anything we're trying to hope for, whether it's running, jumping, moving things, lifting things, it is the impulse apply that's telling the whole story. So I think that's always the safest way to go in terms of understanding what's happened and whether it's affecting your performance or your capacity or capability, or however you frame it, depending on your population. I do find that force at is probably the next best thing that I do still like beat ahead of RFD. So I think if you went to your levels, it would be like impulse is your best, and then force at. We did a white paper when we were at the Olympic Center around this. So there's an article that came out by Maffioletti around RFD and just explaining it and all the problems with it and things. And in it, he said, if there's a section where he says, if you tell someone to, if we use the mid-thigh pulling example, pull as fast as you can and as hard as you can, they will bias naturally to the hard, so the peak. But if you just tell someone fast, then they'll bias to RFD. So when we read that, we said, let's try this. And we actually, for a period of time, a couple months, and where was at that Olympic Center, we had probably 150, 200 athletes of all of these, probably a dozen different sports. And so there's a whole rhythm of like different sports being different times of testing. So in a couple of months, you'll eventually get everyone or almost everyone in the mid-thigh pull situation. So we decide to run our protocol 2 1-second pulls where we tell them to pull as fast as they can, then 2 5-second pulls where the goal is peak force. And it doesn't matter how long, like you don't have to win the first 30 milliseconds. You can just get to your highest number. And then when we ran the data after all that, the RFDs on the short pulls were much more reliable than they were on our previous test and on the heavy pulls, we'll call them. So if you did decide like I'm fully in on RFD and I'm committing to it and I really believe it's the thing, then setting your protocol to tell the athlete, pull as fast as you can, not worrying about what your peak is. And obviously with that, you can only pull as fast as you can for so long. So make it a fairly short rep. We did see the CVs go down significantly. Now, Vald and Hawken and stuff, a lot of them will still present like 50 and 100. Those are still going to be, but that 100 to 250, so 100, 150, 200, 250, those went down a lot. 250 was already decently reliable. Like that was where reliability kind of starts to become acceptable, which usually in research is like 10 to 15.
Right.
So we did get more acceptable so that you could get closer to about 100 milliseconds with like decent confidence if you did that.
Yes.
So if you do have some tests that you're really confident in, you could make sure that you're cueing in a way for that early onset of force. and then use them separately. Now, the thing about the ash, multiple muscles around, we'll call it a vulnerable joint. I find it's still a very difficult thing to like really ramp up in those first 150 milliseconds. Like, you give me strapped into a mid thigh pull where I'm using my entire body and my legs, and anyone who lifts regularly can probably drive their feet down pretty quickly, feel confident about it. You're kind of really fixed. Something with the shoulder, like, even though I know what I want as a sports scientist, I still have a really hard time getting that early onset, like, certain.
Yep.
And so then when I look at our population in baseball, where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around the thing that is your career, that ability to just like, I'm going to do whatever you want with my shoulders. Not always how it goes. Like, there's a bit of fragility there. So I found right away, like, I'm not going to look at the RFD of an ash because I just can't get good data on it. But the calf, I think you're locked in pretty set that you can make decisions on that. So it kind of depends, but to your point, I think RFD is a very tenuous principle. That the concept, don't get me wrong, the concept, like if we're just talking, the ability to perform a rapid contraction and create force rapidly, would that be an advantage, in capacity and the ability to protect yourself and all these things? We all say, yeah, of course, it's wonderful. But the actual measure and relying on it for decisions just doesn't tend to work out very well. And so that's where you have to kind of draw the line and say, hey, maybe at 250, looking at what you're able to do in the first 250 milliseconds is a more appropriate way of looking at it.
Yep, 100%. I've done similar experiments with setting up, and again, his paper I think influenced any of us who have dabbled with this. Biggest things I would say with doing this on especially force plates is then you have to mark those tests so you know the difference, because otherwise most of these metrics will just pull whatever the peak was. So when you do a report, if it was the same setup and you did one specifically for rate and one specifically otherwise, you need to make sure you're separating those out. Otherwise you'll get some, I was like, what the heck is going on here? Because you're seeing peak go up and down. So be aware that if you're doing that, you also have to be a little bit more cognizant of what's going on. Agree 100% as well with the ash test. I find, so I liked the impulse for first 250 milliseconds with that, because rate is what's happening as you are developing force, right? And so impulse is area underneath that. So we're capturing, it's a state, rate is included when we're looking at that. It's also a larger thing. So if there's something significant, I would agree very much that what I'm looking at is probably more their willingness to load into it than it is otherwise. And I use it as a proxy for confidence in the shoulder as well as pain onset. So you'll see a lot of times they're still having some discomfort in that position. They might hit similar peaks, but that other aspect isn't. And that's something that I'll track serially as, are we getting things to continue to calm down? My peak is no longer telling me anything, but I'll get that either the first quarter second impulse or force at quarter second. That tends to work pretty well. From, again, I'm not using it to make big decisions, but it's telling me where their shoulder is at. And if I'm seeing change there consistently over time, I'm much more likely to continue with what I'm doing. And if that's stalled out, I might be adding something else in. So, couple questions I think we can come into because it's appropriate now as opposed to talking about the dynamic task and then coming back. Quinn brings up a very good one about, could you speak on the concept of coefficient of variation and the importance of considering that value for repeated testing?
Yeah, so coefficient of variation is essentially how much your test result changes from repetition to repetition or session to session. So usually when you're talking about, this is essentially a measure of reliability. What does this number vary each time you do it? And anytime you do a test, you really should, you can always find a lot of this stuff online in research, like people have published studies on what's the average reliability of certain, CIS situations, but you really should get in the habit of testing your own devices and tests in your environment.
Yep.
The simplest way is always to be like, pick 10 staff around you or your friends or certain patients and just get them all. So the first one is intraday. So when you do a testing session, if you do 1 to, let's say, 5 reps, what is likely to happen given you're the same human in the same setting, in the same conditions, like what you ate for breakfast, how much you slept last night, whatever. How much is it, if I do 5 ash pushes in a row, what is the chance, how much do they vary each one? And in the literature, they usually always say, it's kind of like one of those things like, why is P 0.05 the number? They say 10% has always been the line of, if it varies less than 10% rep to rep, then it's considered reliable. And anything above 10 is not considered reliable. It's noisy. I'd say in general, there's a lot of these isometric tests that likely should be in the 2 to 4% range. Mid thigh pulls, calf, even a lot of vertical jump metrics. If you're using impulse type stuff and the bigger things and not RFD, you'll get under 5%, which case you can be really confident in that data. That means that if those things only change by a couple percent at a time, then when these changes do occur, you can say, wow, this is real. This person is faster or more powerful or jumps higher, things like that. Then that's intra. You should also know interday. So imagine you're not changing your training program or anything crazy, but you go home, you go to bed, you get up, you do it again. You do 3 reps. Are you likely to still be putting the same ash day to day within a certain amount, or should you understand that there's a bit more variability? Because certain tests you have to start to know, if I tested someone on a Monday and then a Thursday and then a Friday and then a Tuesday, you kind of want to know, like, can I assume the same thing as last week, or is there a different sort of variability that can happen when you come back another day? So those 2 things, intra-session and inter-session, you want to do your best to figure out. You can't probably all get 50 people and 100 people and have a really crazy strong number, but you can usually find out pretty quick how reliable these things are if you just take like 5, 6 people that you work with and you go, hey, today you're going to do 3 reps. We're going to do 3 reps every day, Monday to Friday. We're going to come in, do the same warm up, and we're going to do it. And you can find out pretty quickly whether you can trust the results of that test. If we talk about the ASH, for example, I'm in baseball and in professional baseball. So the ASH is something we use with all of our players, and we find it is highly reliable intraday. But if you have a high throwing day, you're going to probably lose 30 to 40% of your strength the day after. And that's the fitness fatigue paradigm of anything around the shoulder joint being an issue, the day after you throw in a game or on a mound. So we have particular rules around testing around, if a guy threw off a mound, you do not ash him the day after, because it's just going to blow up your models and you're going to go, oh my God, what just happened? It's like, well, hold on. That was going to happen. So right. We know if we're trying to check their ability or capacity in sort of a fresh state, we know which days of the week that we can afford to do that on and which ones we can't, because it would just create more confusion than it's kind of clearing up, at that point. So that's what CV is. CV is that coefficient of variation. It's usually the standard deviation of your testing session or your whatever reps you're collecting divided by the mean of that whole bucket of whatever repetitions you're doing. And then it's a decimal. So if you multiply by 100, if you want to have it in percents, or else if you remember how your decimals work, percent.
Right. Yeah. Move to. I would say not only to understand what you're dealing with and to bring the Quantitude guys into this. One of their quotes is, I never want to see anybody report the reliability of this test is X without having shown me that it was based off of what they did in here, because every time you use a test, reliability is something that you do. It's not this thing that travels with the test. But the second biggest thing is when you do that, even if you only have 3 people in your clinic or 2 people or yourself, and you're just looking at yourself doing this repeatedly, the single biggest thing that it does is make you aware of how bad you are compared to how good you think you are. And that is the single most important aspect here, is it brings your attention to, oh, wow, yeah, I'm not quite what I thought I was. I think for me as well, the formula from classic test theory is helpful to understand this, where you're getting your observed score is equal to the true score plus the error. And so coefficient of variation is measuring how that error fluctuates, right? As well as how the true score fluctuates. And all you're seeing is observed score, and you're trying to identify, how can I stabilize this measure so that my observed score is related to the true score? We always know there's some error, but we're trying to understand if the error is too large, then it's drowning out the signal that's coming from the true score. So I think if you think of that mathematical formula, it's sometimes helpful with understanding this.
If I could add to that, the one thing I think it's a bit of a I'll say mind fuck sometimes for people when they first are just doing testing. They go, hey, I have the number. The assumption is like what you just saw is the answer. But the truth is, we don't know which repetition. If you did 100 repetitions of a jump or a press or a isometric thing, the idea is we now have this spectrum of results that are around the real number of what Scott Morrison's actual strength is. But on every rep, there's a reason
Very
why
low.
we might not be seeing the actual thing. And so to start to see that, like, the ash you just did today doesn't necessarily mean that's your ash. Your ash is within this bandwidth of the observed test and that error and whatever. And we're just hoping that once this bandwidth gets down, then that just increases our confidence that we know in general where you live. But if you all of a sudden have this dot with bandwidths, confidence intervals that are crazy high, then you just go, I don't know where you technically are for real. I just have an observed point anywhere in this space. But if I repeat this test, it could be anywhere in that space. And the idea that we nailed the score on that one test, we kind of have to, eliminate that from our minds and go, we're just getting this bandwidth. And hopefully the better we are at our protocols, and like you said, the kind of error rate or coefficient of variation tells us that we're getting better and better at protocols, both explaining the test, administering the test, setting it up, getting that patient ready to test, warmed up, and all that jazz. That if these error rates get lower and lower, then we're getting much closer to the true value. But any observed value could be wrong, right? Like it's
Right.
not necessarily it. So
Yeah.
once I close my door, the dog's gonna bark.
You're good. I think this is why probability is usually taught with like marble or a jar full of some colored candy, where the idea is if you just reach in and pull out one candy and you look at the color, you can't say that is a jar full of red candies. But the more times you reach into the jar and sample, the more likely it is that you know the distribution of what's in there. So, Lenny McCrana asked, what about RFD for ACL return to play decision making?
I mean, it wouldn't. You could name a different injury, and I wouldn't change my story. The story is again that the concept is good, but that the values are typically very noisy, and you could just find it for yourself by looking at the RFD on whatever version you're looking at, whether you're doing it yourself in Excel or if you're doing it in VALD or other. But the chances are, if you're under 250 milliseconds, you're going to see 20 to 50% variance, in which case you're saying that you're anywhere from 2,000 newtons a second to 20,000 newtons a second. And this rep, I just saw a 10, but then the rep before I saw a 3. And in which case I go, I don't know. Are you a 3 today or 10 today? So kind of the same. But the idea, if we go back to the start, the idea of knowing how quickly can you produce force is important. So that's where like force at 250 milliseconds of an isometric test would give a better story. And then we skipped this part, we never got to it, but if we want to jump into now a jump, so a dynamic exercise, you will
Yeah,
start.
let's go into the dynamic. I think it's
So now you'll start to see whether someone's truly ready by how quickly they want to load a jump. So one of the things that has come up anecdotally, and then there's studies now that have shown this, is that in a bilateral test like a jump, where let's say it's extremely demanding neuromuscularly to a successful vertical jump involves dropping fairly aggressively and then driving up very aggressively. So to get your best height in a really powerful or high jump, you're going to load fast and then push fast. So when you try to do that, what we see in both the literature and if you guys do collect jumps or you have or want to try, you'll likely see this, is that the affected leg or injured leg or whatever language you want to use will be the limiting factor. So it will not be able to keep up with the fast leg, but your body tries. So then what happens is the force time tracing will be affected by the fact that your, say, left ACL and all the everything that goes with it, left quad, left hamstring, left glute, left everything, will bring down the right rather than it go, oh, sweet, you're ready to go at 100 miles an hour. I'll meet you there. It'll go, ooh, it turns out we can only go 70 because, I'm holding us back. So that's where going to that dynamic level, you start to see these patterns of eccentric duration. You could look at eccentric RFD. Some companies do that. But to Scott's point, you're probably better off looking at eccentric braking or decel impulse, the impulse you create in the downward phase. You can look at the depth you reach, whether you're trusting your legs in. One of the things we know is like you're not vulnerable in your extension, right? Like that's if you put a heavy backpack on, you're happy standing up with it. You're not happy in a squat with it. So what people will do is we'll avoid those places where they're vulnerable, that deeper squat. But in reality, it would eventually create a much more powerful jump because you're using more muscle. So there's patterns that occur that you say, wow, there's an avoidance strategy. You're avoiding deeper depths, avoiding a fast rate of contraction. And then you'll also, if you have bilateral plates, see the way that you load left leg and right leg. So there's kind of like three different avenues you can look at. The temporal aspect, time, how quickly are you creating the jump? You can look at left to right. Are you favoring one leg or another in different phases of the jump? And then you can look at, again, at the depth, which usually will go with time, but it could be, they could separate a little bit and enough that's significant. So those are things that will now tell you a lot about the quote unquote RFD of a limb in return to play without having to take RFD specifically and relying on that value, because unfortunately the squiggly line doesn't always make for a straight line the way RFD
right.
technically works in a mathematical sense.
So, and there are some approaches that are taken to modify that, and you're giving up the ability to discuss RFD within a, let's say, first 100 milliseconds. But some of Dan Cobian's work, for instance, looking at 20 to 80% of maximum and taking the average rate of force development within that, that is going to give you more of an overall rate. So you can't be as specific to different time points, but it tends to be more stable of a measure. I mean, the most stable is always going to be 0 to peak force. You're going to get a good measure, but then it gives you almost no value because it's too broad of a spectrum to tell you what's happening. We already know that rate is dropping as you approach that. So we have to cut off the ends, and that's why they do the 20% off of each end, lets you kind of get that maximal part of the slope. So there are ways to do it. The other nice thing I would say, where I think we would agree, we might disagree, with the knee, is you can set it up and it's an isolated single joint, and that lets you be much more precise as opposed to isometric mid-thigh pull where you have multiple degrees of freedom going on. There's a whole lot more noise being brought to the table. Whereas if I'm doing if I want RFD, I'm going to maximize my ability, and that's going to be a rigid device that's set up rigid fixation, cueing well, single
Knee
joint.
extension,
Yes.
like
Yes.
a
Knee
dynamometer or
extension. Yeah.
a cuff and
Yep.
a queen scale or whatever. Yes, I agree there. And then, in which case, you would almost be aggregating the RFDs of like the three muscle groups around the joint to say, yes, we've reached that in quad, glute,
Right.
ham, or calf, quad, glute. But
Right.
because interestingly, one thing that we see too is single limb jumping is
Yeah.
kind
That
of
was
the
my next
same
question.
thing. It allows you to sort of hide because you don't load near as quickly. So I said in bilateral jumping, it's the injured leg that will sort of slow down the faster one. But having said that, there's a peer pressure from the good leg to try. So it holds it back, but it tries and embarrasses itself. It's kind of like what happens. It's like the friend at the party who's like, I can do that. And then it realizes it doesn't play sports and it can't. When you do single limb jumping, you'll find they'll look much closer together than when you compare asymmetries in bilateral, at least in affected individuals, because you can really brain body can really gear themselves to like put yourself in a favorable position for say I'm my left leg jump versus my right, and then as soon as you go bilateral, it tries to keep up with the fast one, but it slows it down, but it ends up showing that it's not ready yet. So it's worth knowing where is my single leg jump versus before compared to the other leg. But it won't be the one that essentially tells you what's going to happen out there. If I give an
Right.
example back to the calf thing. So there's an athlete that I've been working with who had an Achilles rupture last year. So we do, seated calf, we do standing, single leg and bilateral. We do jumps unilateral, we do jumps bilateral. The unilateral calf kind of tells us where the tissue is at, and it gave us confidence at a certain point that the gap had closed, like the tissue is not too bad, we'll call it, and we can start doing activities. But once we went back to activity in the bilateral sense, the asymmetry grew again because we started to do so much normal activity that they went back to favoring the strong leg or the uninjured leg. And so when we allowed him to just push off of one leg and he can put all his might and energy into it, the asymmetry looks better. But anytime we try and get both legs to work at the same time, the gap is still a bit bigger than we like. So it's one of those things that I've now seen over the years in the Olympic Center, now at the Cubs, that this is a thing that repeats. It's not like I saw one time and it's not ever seen again. But the bilateral will be a bilateral vertical jump, for example, or any bilateral leg lower body test or upper body test, if that's what you're looking at, will essentially show you the truth at the end when you're nearing return to play of what you trust the most in really rapid function. But you have to clear the unilateral level first to know that if I had to, I can push in that leg and it can give me above the threshold that I needed, right? And that's where, like, when we first started doing, say, these seated and standing calf tests, like the gap was massive because he wasn't yet cleared to run and do all the things. So it was understandable. Then we got them close enough to a place where we could start running and everything worked out. And like he has returned to play, but there's still a small gap that exists that we're now having to be a bit more creative with, because when we go into bilateral stuff, he now moves back into favoring the good, even though we, in one-on-one situation, got them both close enough that you go, oh, that's within a normal range of every other athlete we have in there when he does his unilateral jumping, his unilateral calf raises. But when he goes bilateral, then he shifts back because it's all about patterning right at the end.
And we see the same thing with the quad, where you'll train the quad up and then you let them go return to play. You test them 6 or 8 weeks later, and they've actually lost strength, both with an ACL, with patellofemoral pain, with patellar tendinopathy, especially. Tendinopathy is a big one where I'll see this. And you just have to go keep doing the things that isolate the thing that mattered while you still play, because you're not going to necessarily load that sufficiently. You're going to come off of it. With your single leg jump, and I think this this will cover both of them. So we're talking counter movement jump here because honestly, that's probably the most important metric. Like you can do other things. Squat jump, personally, I've just stopped because unless you have somebody who is good at moving, listens well, and you can test them repeatedly, you're going to get a muted counter movement jump. And that is the other thing that doing force play stuff and looking at this starts relating you see is you're always seeing that little counter movement. It's so it's not impossible. It's so much work compared to the little bit that gives me that I'm not already getting from the counter movement that personally, in a clinical sense, pretty much counter movement is where I do, and then single double. But metrics, right? So you mentioned single, you might get even similar jump heights, right, versus left, but your movement time or your drop, right? So what things are you looking at? Remember, we have thousands of things to look at, but there's a few that tell us what's going on. If we look at too few, we think things are good, but we're not actually tracking what happened, right? So if you just look at jump height, you have no idea how they got there. So just like we were talking about, impulse is rate and the force that you get to. It's made up of two constructs. Jump height is a combination of multiple things. So what are the things that you're looking at that doesn't let the patient hide some of these things?
So I'll say one like mea culpa. When I first started with the force plate stuff and we were building our own system, we were getting into the weeds of the physics and stuff. I got snobby and said, power is just a number. I said, there's all this stuff happens, a million metrics, and then all people want to know is power. Like power just happens once. Like you don't even know how you got there. Having said that, it is a really good summary of capacity. So when you're more or less incapable, your power output will be much lower. And then you do need to get it back to the same level. So overarching metric, it's a great place to start because you probably, when you're still in that return to play zone where you're not quite ready, you'll probably see it scaling up over time as you see function happening in the training room, in the gym, and whatever. So it can be a very good start point to just say, yes, are you capable of the things you used to be? And for us in baseball, power will be something we look at often because at the end of the day, it actually does predict our performance a lot in terms of like how hard I can throw or how hard I can hit the ball. So I do want to reflect on that. And I usually, if I'm explaining to coaches what is peak power, I say it is the metric of general capacity to do work that our guys have. So the guys who can do more work can probably hit harder.
So to be clear though, you're saying peak power here, not average power. And there's a lot of power metrics you can look at. You're looking at peak.
So I'm talking peak power, and I'm saying it is worth keeping in your list of like, I want to look at.
Yeah. What time point of the jump is peak power being achieved?
When you come off the ground, typically, or right around when you come off the ground, right before you come off the ground, really, because you're actually not pushing off the last couple milliseconds.
Right.
But so it's right before you leave the ground, typically. So peak power is definitely worth it. But to your point, it's not explaining how you got there. The next thing we'll look at is eccentric duration. That's how quickly do I unload myself to be able to push vertically. Because when we drop in a vertical jump, and I'm not sure how many people on the call have used force plates yet, but when you see yourself drop down, it's a little bit of a sorcery of physics where you actually become unweighted. Your body mass disappears. We relax enough and kind of come off the plates to fall that in that moment of relaxation, we actually become super light and get really close to not weighing anything. So there's this weight loss pill that we take. And then we find ourselves in the bottom because with too much tension, you can't like flex quickly. So when we find ourselves in the bottom, that's when a lot of the force is created. That huge moment of force of stopping your downward acceleration to start upward acceleration is essentially where most of the work happens in your jump. And so what we find is, and when I say we, I mean the general community of sports performance and sports science, better, more athletic jumping, greater outcomes occur when you can drop to the right depth in a much shorter time. If you trust your tissues more, because your tissues are better, they're more explosive or whatever. We can go with firing rates and all these different things about coordination, but when you're a better athlete or you're more prepared to play, you drop faster, and that's going to be the biggest differentiator. The actual upward portion is very stable in a human. The amount of time it takes to go from the bottom to off the ground does not change much jump to jump and day to day, but how quickly you're willing to load down does change day to day. You're fresh, fitness fatigue paradigm, you're fresh, you load faster. You're tired, you load much slower. But the actual upward portion doesn't actually change as much. If I snipped the two out, it would actually stay concentric most of the time. It would stay pretty close, but the eccentric duration is where all that change happens. So eccentric duration is a big one. RSI modified or FTCT ratio is another one that's extremely important. So what that does, FTCT I like better because it seems more like scientific integrity, to be honest, but it's taking the time in the air by the time on the ground. So how long did it take you to create the thing you did? And it's a ratio. With RSI mod, they take the height you achieved divided by the time it took, and then they create a metric of units that aren't really units, and then it becomes a weird conversation. At the end of the day, though, they will explain each other 98% of the time, 99% of the time. So you could literally just decide I'm going to take one or the other and I'm going to run with it because they tell the same story. It's the same movie.
Right. Yeah. But
so
the nice thing about the flight time contact time, the nice thing about flight time contact time is it cues you to look at contact time. Because it's in the name, right? So it just makes sense, I think, when you're explaining it to someone or when you're looking at it yourself. Whereas RSI mod takes a few more steps. So, yeah,
I'm
with you
peeking, I'm peeking on the side of this question. So the standardization question is always a weird one because in science, the idea of replication is that you can set all of the parameters the same to know if you're getting the same answer twice in a row. In reality, for the fitness fatigue effect or the return to play effect to be apparent, you don't want to standardize it because you want the self-selection to be the story. So one thing we find is that FT tracing of a counter movement jump in a normal human is like their fingerprint. You ask them to jump 5 times in a row, and it's creepily odd that they will look the same. The tracings are very close because most of the metrics are 2 to 4% different. So then what happens is when you do have the capacity to do more, or you don't have the capacity, or you have the capacity to do less, you will see that reflected in the strategy they choose. And most of the time, without further knowledge, what'll happen is an athlete will go to similar depth and they'll just take longer to do it. And then, in true fatigue, you take longer and you jump lower. That's like red all over. That's just a poor jump. First sign of fatigue is I take a little longer to create the same jump. Freshness or new adaptation is I can load even faster to create the same jump. And then the ultimate double whammy is I load faster and jump higher, which usually doesn't happen in an instant. That's usually like multiple training blocks in a row to get there. You kind of change one at a time. So you cue them to load as quick as they can and jump as high as you can. It kind of goes back to the Maffioletti thing that you kind of have to touch on both points in order to get as close as you can to a good strategy. If you do it a lot, you'll see the guy who takes way too long to go down. You go, "Whoa, that's not going to work for you. Just trust me that that's not your best strategy." And then for the most part, though, guys will start to go. Now, over time, the one thing I'll say that happens is if athletes see their data, power output can be hacked with really shallow counter movement depths. 25, 20 centimeters, we'll call it almost like a pogo hop. You can get these really high power outputs because the range of motion is so small that it skews to high power, but it's not the same type of jump as how I'd explain to an athlete and say, stop doing it. So we have that all the time where guys start to see a leaderboard, or they saw another guy hit this huge power, they didn't, that they all of a sudden realized they could get a high score by doing that. And you have to get, you did it, but I'm not going to count it. I'm throwing the data out. So be proud, but go back to jumping how you did before. You need about 40 centimeters of depth here for it to be a real counter movement jump. So there is a way to look at the data after the fact to see if a person's been cheating or not cheating, but for the most part, self-selected depth will tell the story that you want, and the variation is the story, of what's happening.
Yeah, that is the big thing, because if you're using this to allow them to express, like you said, what's going on, you have to cue consistently, but the consistent cueing needs to afford them the ability to fluctuate. And I would say from a clinical perspective, I definitely look at power less, and I'm looking more at that impulse during the eccentric deceleration or braking or whatever, your software will name it what it does. Understand what that is, that point where you're talking about that you've gone from my weight loss journey is over and now I'm trying to maximize, right? I need to stop before I hit. That is the point at which your legs have to solve the problem the fastest with the highest amount of impulse needed to change, because of the momentum is the highest. So when I'm looking at what does this person do when they're taken to the edge, that is usually where I'm seeing the asymmetries, the problems occur. That seems to be the thing that is telling me the most about it. And you can't cheat it.
And this hasn't come up in the questions, but when I do look at asymmetries, because I do in jumping, I try to aggregate the asymmetry of eccentric impulse, the asymmetry of concentric impulse, and then the asymmetry of peak landing force. One alone probably won't tell you the story, but looking at all three kind of will. And as we kind of have alluded to a bunch of times in this talk, is that taking the entire impulse of a phase is going to give you much more reliability versus an RFD or a peak force or whatever. And if we go back to thought experiments, like the RFD might explain the thing, right? Like in theory, the slope of how quickly you can produce force is the story of, that readiness of that tissue or that leg or that body to create force is great. It's just that in reality, the data doesn't bear that out. It's just too noisy to know that is what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Because one thing we see is like there's different stories or narratives you can tell about the phases of a jump. Are you afraid to load it when you go down? Now the thing is unloading, as I just explained, is actually not stressful, right? Like by definition, you're technically not applying force to your limbs. You're taking force away, which is sort of not really a thing that's possible, but you're unweighting. So it's actually not difficult on your legs. So looking at that alone is not going to tell you the story. And then you start to apply in the eccentric phase, which is good. And then concentrically, you're going to push. And then when you land, one, there's a trust aspect. Do I trust the limb to land on it in first? But there's also the aspect of if you jumped off balance, you're going to have to land on one side. So there is a certain amount of noise to that to go like, okay, I'm going to take this with a grain of salt. So that's why I kind of look at eccentric, concentric, and landing force, and I'll sort of look at them as a tableau and go, I like the way this is going. Because at first you might say, well, you're loading your left limb when you go down, but once you start coming up, you switch completely to your right. You literally do the whole, okay, I'm going to get up off this leg, right? And you go, there's clearly a thing happening when push comes to shove, you have to come off the ground. You've decided to go all in on one. And then once that happens, landing from the air, if your body tilts, it might tell a story, but you might also hide something if you're afraid of landing on it. So I will say with asymmetry, you have to be really careful if you pick one moment and make judgments on it, but it can definitely tell a story. It's not like it's something you want to consider in your return to play. You just have to figure out, okay, what is the whole narrative and what kind of judgments can I make about that?
Yeah. A couple questions that have popped up that I want to get to, especially since we're getting over the hour mark when people start usually leaving. So make sure they get to them. The first one was frequency of testing. Luke is asking, what kind of frequency are you looking at with these tests? And their experience, sometimes something like an ISO pool could appear pretty fatiguing to the subject, and maybe they perform it at a lower effort than others like daily jumps, Nordberg, or ASH testing. I would say daily jumps are very much like if someone's going to mail it in, it's very frequently on the jump. They're just not. That's the one that's hard to get people
Yeah.
to do.
Isometric tests, while they are MVC, like 100% maximum voluntary contraction, because there's no lengthening or shortening, it's actually pretty easy on the metabolic side and the DOM side. So surprisingly, isometric tests can be redone very frequently. Like you could do them daily if you wanted to know. The mid-thigh pull, I will put an exception on because you're just creating such a high forces across multi-joints that I agree it's a big pill to take and that you wouldn't do those daily. But we found like when we're concerned about a guy's shoulder, for example, I can ash a guy 4 days in a row. It's not going to cause discomfort, pain, DOMs, anything. And the data will stay pretty clear as long as he didn't say just throw a 80 pitch game in between those. And then I'm sure ERIR, we see the same thing, the calf stuff, like the Achilles guy, like once we got used to these tests, it's one of those, like the moment he feels better, he's going to be like, let's do it again. I want to show you I'm better. I can feel it. I bounced out of bed. I'm crushing the stairs down to breakfast and like, let's do it again. I want to show you like I'm better today, which you do. If he is, right? And then that it goes into the dossier of possible test results. As we talked about, any test is never the outcome. It's a range of possible outcomes in his capacity. So frequency, I would say you'd always rather try to test more frequently than not. Jumps you can do daily, but I'd say 3 times a week is probably plenty for most. Daily does get exhausting. We did daily with a lot of Olympians, but in baseball we do 3 times a week. Isometric tests in a healthy population, we go 2 to 3 weeks for ASH and hamstrings and 4 weeks for mid-thigh pull. And that's not necessarily just because of discomfort, but it's more because all of your legs and strength and stuff, it's such a harder thing to change that you wait for the more muscle groups you're looking at, it kind of probably wait for a longer training block to end. Yeah. It's actually like a mid-thigh pull is over time with what I've done in different populations over the last 6-7 years or I guess 8 years now, it's usually like 2 to 3% CV rep to rep and day to day. So you're really, unless someone really got stronger, which we know doesn't happen in a day, like you're not likely going to see a different test result. So you don't want to waste those bullets too many times if you don't need to. And you can just say, hey, let's probably do this in a month, because you're not going to change your lower body strength that quickly for that multi-joint exercise. But really small stuff like IRER, ASH, different things like that. When we see a questionable score, we will literally say, we're going to test this 3 days in a row to know what's the real story. Did you just not sleep last night, or you had this weird thing, and then all of a sudden we get 2 days in a row where it's awesome, and we go, red alert gone, we forgot about it. Like we didn't need to freak out. This is cool, we're good. But if we get 2 in a row that are low, or 3 in a row, then we go, okay, there's a thing here. Something's down.
Yep.
Your capacity of whatever we'll call it. ASH is always a tricky one. I always say it's I say upper body, the ability to generate force around the shoulder joint, because it's never a muscle, right? That's the thing about ASH that's tricky, is someone's like, which muscle are we doing? We're like, no, we're generalizing here around concept.
Yes.
So isometric,
Do you do?
you'll find that once an athlete is used to the test, I will say that they actually become really good with and fine with frequency of testing. So
Yep.
in a lot of our return to plays, if once we've shown them like these are the tests that we're landmarking, they're like, all okay. Like we tell guys that their ash needs to be a certain point to throw. All of a sudden, those guys are willing to test Ash's offensive pass, right? Like
Yep.
it becomes one of those things where we tell a story at first that like, hey, this is going to be hard. He won't want to do it again, but it turns out like if he has incentives to score well to do his thing, like he's willing to do that all the time. It turns out isometric tests are pretty friendly to joint and muscle.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll add that, like I was mentioning earlier, that first quarter, second, I'm using more as a proxy for their tolerance, probably. That if that is my goal, I test more frequently. If my goal is peak force, I'm backing off to just a sort of base rate of how long would I expect it to take for change to occur significantly. But early on, especially when I'm dealing with a tendinopathy or something where there might be some sort of a inhibition aspect or fear avoidance aspect, I will test that whenever I'm seeing the patient. I don't have a problem with that. But if my goal is improving strength, I'm not testing that every time because if they're improving, then it's not a strength issue. So if I'm confident enough that it is a strength that we need adaptation, then I'm starting to spread things out a little more.
And we have to be critical too about what were the detraining effects, because I'll give an example. We had a situation with a guy doing a hamstring return play last year where I set a standard of I need to see this result in order to clear this guy to play on a eccentric, Nordic eccentric exercise, whatever we call it. And I had a question from a practitioner that was like, well, his score was X last time. Do we really think it's going to change in the next couple of days? Because otherwise, we're talking about 3 more weeks for this, rehab to build strength. And I said, we're on day 12 of this hamstring rehab. Like, he actually shouldn't be weaker, right? Like, or significantly weaker. Anything we're seeing is protection. It's, comfort. It's courage. All these different things. So there is very possible that we expose a stimulus of a certain percentage of running that he didn't try yet, or an exercise that he hadn't done yet, that might clear our inhibition. That very much tomorrow he could hit my score. Like, that's where you have to be mindful of when we're talking about long-term rehabs, ACLs, tendon ruptures, Tommy Johns, other ligament surgeries, and you're talking about the 8 to 12 months range, then you very well might need to wait time for peak force to come back in a tissue that was significantly atrophied or deconditioned. But in the shorter time frames, be ready to test frequently, because a lot of times that force and rate are an issue strictly of coordination and timing. Like that's protection, inhibition, comfort, willingness, things like that sometimes can be erased in a day of soft tissue, certain isometric, giving 100%, and then maybe, hey, I sprinted for the first time and I'm not hurt. Now I'm willing to try that exercise because I don't fear hurting myself again, right? Like, so that's also to your point around like expectations of how much values will change, is like we have to zoom out and think critically. Like if this is been a 14-day rehab, like we shouldn't actually have lost significant peak force in a general sense. The muscle still has the structure in there and the size and mass and cross-sectional area to do that again. We just have to figure out how to unlock that, which could be a day, a session. It could be 2 days. So being willing to retest at that point of late return to play, like test as often as you need to get the score that you've told yourself, like gives you confidence that this person's ready to play and run and change directions and things like that.
Thanks. I'm going to get these last 2 in real quick, and then Cory, you're welcome to hang out. We usually hang out and chat, or you're welcome to leave. I know it's been a little while and you've had a busy day, but anybody who wants to hang around, chat longer, I usually try and leave it on for a little bit more. But the 2 questions Rob Panarello asks if the catch in Olympic weightlifting correlates to improvements in the eccentric duration metric. And then Ryan asks if just your thoughts about using force plates in earlier phases of rehab, like well before return to sport decisions. You find force plates can give you an advantage in delivering patient care before people are repeatedly doing single leg jump kind of movement and stuff. I think your last comment answered that very well, about what, like how you're using it in that early phase. But if you wanted to add anything else, but yeah, Rob's question about the catch of Olympic weightlifting.
So there's not a lot of data in the literature about the catch, right? Like lately, the Sucamel Comfort Group have been looking at all these catch, no catch stuff. When I did my intro, I mentioned that at the time, I was amateur weightlifting. I did not have a score that's worth telling anyone else about who's in the business. But, for myself, I'll just explain that I was cleaning, snatching, jerking every day for training with a coach that was helping me that did this for a living. Even though I was certified as a coach, I entrusted myself to another coach to allow me to just train as an athlete and stuff. So at the time, I was a weightlifter, I'll call it, but just nothing to compete. I did a couple of meets just for fun, but I wasn't in any type of tunnel of like performance. Having said that, so I used Pasco's at the time and was looking at full catches, drops and different things. And the thing about the physics of a catch that's really bizarre, when we see a catch happen, we imagine this stiffness and we imagine this bracing being so important. And when you fail, you feel, when you drop a clean or a snatch and you fail, you feel your body letting you down at not being able to do that. But usually it's technical about it not being in the right place. When you're technically sound, the catch actually happens where a bar is at the peak of its parabola of a projectile, and the peak of a projectile is actually zero acceleration up or down, so the force is actually nil. So like the bar doesn't weigh more than what it does. So you're actually like, if you catch it at the right place at the right time, it's actually not hard at all on you. And getting it to the right place is the hardest thing. So the short answer is I don't actually think that the catch, if you do it well and you're well coached and you're like, it stays close to your body and you're under it, is actually doing much for you as a training tool, like the actual catch. And it only feels like the hardest thing you've ever done when you miss it. Like if I catch a clean in front of my body and I'm trying to rescue it, like anterior core, legs, and everything feels like, oh my God, this thing I have to do to rescue this bar feels like the hardest training of all time. But really, the parts that are really crushing us in Olympic lifting are either the hang. So if I'm dipping with the bar, it's like a counter movement and jump, I'm unloading, creating a huge eccentric force and then reloading. And when I do from the floor, when Olympic weightlifters pass their knee, they do the same thing that you do in counter movement jumping. They actually unweight themselves, they scoop under the bar, and then they reapply this force eccentrically first and then concentrically from there. They kind of stop the bar's momentum and drive it up. So I don't really think the catch is going to move a lot, but dropping before. So catching in the bottom, like more knee flexion, hip flexion, and all that jazz. Or just letting yourself fall and training that ability. So I'm reading this question at the same time. And
That's all right. Yeah, Rob, if you want to unmute, that might be easier.
Yeah, I mean, you're just speaking about the eccentric duration metric, and you have to drop at high velocity, which there's a relaxation.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if some point during the rehab, if you could teach your athletes to catch the barbell, do you think that would have a correlation, for lack of a better word, or association to improvement of that metric?
I actually do. So now that I did all that and talked about the catch at kind of like whatever, the standing position or where I caught the bar. So an example, like I'm guessing that Rob has coached and done a lot of Olympic lifting, and that's why he's asking. But
Rob is a Hall of Fame strength coach, so yeah, he's the
so,
man.
so if I go back to when I moonlighted as pretending to be an Olympic weightlifter, and that was never really good. Um, for me, that was a huge thing, and I do think the training in Olympic weightlifting did affect my ability to jump. Going from a decently high block and learning how to pull on the bar, drop under it to be able to get out of a clean from, say, medium to high blocks was a thing that I know anecdotally definitely changed how quickly I could relax and drop under the bar and drop into that position to burst out of. So I do definitely think that training and weightlifting in different positions could have a really big effect on that relaxation into stiffness, into boom, concentric explosions and rocket ships and to the moon things
the
that
moon. Invest in Dogecoin, right? That's what we got from this is don't get force plates, get the Dogecoin. Thanks, Cory. I think you could spend forever on this because there's so much to go into, and I would strongly recommend anybody who is interested in going deeper. If you pick up the chapter Cory wrote in the NSCA text, it's a very simple, clear kind of approach. Covers a lot of this and into some other stuff. Jason Lake is also a good resource. He's written a number of blog posts on this that you can just kind of gives you a good idea. But I think that the key thing is the concepts you're talking about, the jump. Instead of looking at one metric telling you everything, you have to triangulate in on this. You have to measure the idea of this person's ability with multiple different domains or multiple different things. I think if I'm remembering right, Jason Lake does the ODS system where he talks about basically you're looking at an output, you're looking at a driver, and then you're looking at a what does S stand for? Strategy. And those are the kind of three key things that you want a metric for each of those as you're going through. And that's kind of what you were talking about there, Cory. All right.
Yeah,
So
I just added to the chat. I assume many of you have seen it at some point. I don't even know if they still publish, but Aspetar Sport Medicine Journal, they always had really high quality, both physical magazines and just appearance of articles online. But there are a handful. So my co-author, Daniel Cohen, who co-founded ForceDex, and then a few other people have. Chris Bishop is one. If you look in the literature, Bishop's PhD was all around different types of asymmetry and the kind of difficulty of like, how do we define unasymmetry? Like, because you could say, is it left versus right? Is it left versus right relative to the total? Is it boom, boom, boom? So there's a couple different articles in there that have come out around looking at asymmetry in jumps. There's looking at unilateral versus bilateral, and are they the same, which I alluded to. So there's a few different articles in Aspetar around jumping and force plates as well, if you want to look there, that are free. So you can download those individually as PDFs, or they don't mail real magazines anymore, do they, Scott? You must have had.
I have not seen a real one in a while, but I also pretty much stopped all of that because it's a lot easier to read it on an iPad or a computer. So, but yeah, thanks, Cory. Ton of good information.
Say